The cruelest words are never shouted in anger. They are spoken calmly by someone you trusted with your heart. The great hall of Silver Moon Palace shimmered beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers as nobles gathered for the annual moon blessing ceremony. Every eye turned toward Claire Bennett, a young Omega dressed in a simple ivory gown that reflected elegance without extravagance. She had never desired the attention surrounding her. She had only come because the king himself had summoned her. Standing upon the marble platform, King Adrian Whitmore looked every bit the ruler his people admired. His black ceremonial cloak flowed behind him, a silver crown rested lightly upon his dark hair, and his expression remained composed as members of the royal council whispered around him. For weeks they had insisted that Claire could not be trusted. Anonymous letters had appeared inside the palace claiming she had hidden dangerous secrets and sought influence over the throne through the sacred mate bond. Adrian had searched for proof, but fear and pride quietly filled the empty spaces where certainty should have been. Claire stood several feet away, her blue eyes searching his face for reassurance. The invisible bond connecting them had awakened days earlier, filling her heart with hope she had never dared to imagine. She believed that once Adrian looked into her eyes, he would recognize the truth she carried. Instead, silence stretched across the hall until Adrian finally spoke. His voice was steady enough to command an entire kingdom, yet every word shattered something invisible between them. Claire Bennett, until every question surrounding these accusations has been answered, I cannot recognize you as my destined mate. A quiet gasp spread across the audience. Claire did not immediately react. She simply stared at him as though waiting for the rest of the sentence, believing he would smile and explain it had all been a misunderstanding. But the explanation never came. Around her, whispered conversations grew louder. Some nobles lowered their eyes with sympathy, while others exchanged satisfied smiles. Claire felt the warmth inside her chest slowly disappear, replaced by an emptiness she had never known before. She did not argue. She did not plead. She bowed respectfully to the throne, even though tears had already begun gathering in her eyes. I understand, Your Majesty, she answered softly. The title hurt more than she expected. She turned and walked across the enormous hall with graceful dignity, refusing to let anyone see her break. The towering palace doors opened before her, revealing gray skies and a cold autumn rain waiting outside. She stepped into the storm without once looking back. Adrian watched her disappear beyond the palace courtyard. Something inside him urged him to stop her, to call her name, to ask one more question before letting her leave. Instead, he remained standing beside the throne while the royal council quietly praised his judgment. Their approval sounded strangely distant. Hours later, the palace had grown silent. Adrian stood alone on the balcony overlooking rain-soaked gardens where Claire had walked only a short time before. The invisible bond between them had not faded. If anything, it had become heavier, filling every quiet moment with an ache he could neither explain nor escape. He told himself he had protected the kingdom. He convinced himself that caution had been the duty of every king. Yet somewhere beyond the palace walls, Claire walked into the unknown carrying nothing except a broken heart, while the man who had broken it had no idea that the price of one fearful decision had only begun to reveal itself. The palace faded behind Claire Bennett as steady autumn rain washed the marble roads until they reflected nothing but gray skies. She walked without knowing where the road would end, because returning was no longer an option. Every step carried her farther from the only place she had ever imagined calling home. Yet the invisible bond connecting her to Adrian refused to disappear. It lingered quietly inside her heart, not as comfort, but as a painful reminder of everything she had lost. By the following afternoon, she arrived in the small town of Willow Creek, nearly 80 miles south of the capital. It was a peaceful farming community surrounded by rolling hills, apple orchards, and narrow streams where people cared more about weather than royal gossip. No one recognized the young Omega who had once stood before the throne. To them, she was simply Claire, a quiet traveler looking for honest work and a fresh beginning. An elderly widow named Margaret offered her a small room above a flower shop in exchange for helping arrange bouquets and caring for the garden each morning. Claire accepted with a grateful smile, relieved that someone had welcomed her without asking about her past. Days slowly turned into weeks. Every sunrise found Claire trimming roses, watering lavender, and greeting customers with gentle kindness. Children stopped to watch her weave wildflowers into colorful arrangements while elderly neighbors thanked her for bringing fresh blooms to lonely homes. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life gradually softened the sharp edges of her broken heart. She still missed Adrian, but she no longer cried every night. Instead, she learned that healing sometimes arrived disguised as simple routines shared with kind strangers. Back inside Silver Moon Palace, life appeared unchanged to everyone except the king himself. Council meetings continued. Royal ceremonies filled the calendar. Noble families praised Adrian for protecting the throne with careful judgment. Yet every victory felt strangely hollow. He often found himself staring toward the empty doorway where Claire had disappeared, replaying their final conversation until every word echoed louder than the applause surrounding him. At night, sleep became increasingly difficult. Whenever silence settled over the palace, the mate bond awakened with quiet persistence. Adrian would suddenly pause while reading reports or signing royal documents, overwhelmed by an unfamiliar wave of sadness that did not feel entirely like his own. He tried convincing himself that time would weaken the connection, but each passing day seemed to strengthen it instead. One evening, the royal chef prepared Adrian's favorite meal, yet he barely touched it. The food had lost its flavor. Music inside the banquet hall sounded distant. Even the magnificent palace gardens felt empty despite blooming autumn flowers. Lucas Mercer quietly noticed the changes but chose not to speak until one peaceful morning when he found the king standing alone beside the palace lake before sunrise. "Your Majesty," Lucas said gently, "you have watched this water every morning for nearly 3 weeks." Adrian looked across the still surface where fallen leaves drifted without direction. "Have I?" Lucas nodded. "You have been searching for someone who is no longer here." Adrian remained silent for several moments before answering honestly for the first time. "I believed I was protecting the kingdom." His voice became quieter. "Now I cannot decide whether I protected it or simply protected my own pride." Hundreds of miles away, Claire stood beneath the warm afternoon sun arranging white daisies outside Margaret's flower shop. She smiled as a little girl accepted a small bouquet with joyful gratitude. For the first time since leaving the palace, Claire felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. It was not hope that Adrian would come for her. It was the quiet belief that even a broken heart could learn how to bloom again. Nearly a month passed before fate quietly placed the first crack in the wall Adrian had built around his decision. It arrived without warning on an ordinary afternoon as royal archivists sorted forgotten correspondence collected during the weeks surrounding the moon blessing ceremony. One elderly clerk approached the throne carrying a small wooden box that had been discovered inside a locked cabinet belonging to a former palace advisor who had unexpectedly resigned only days after Claire left the kingdom. Adrian accepted the box without much thought, expecting little more than outdated reports. Instead, he found several sealed letters bearing identical handwriting to the anonymous accusations that had destroyed Claire's reputation. His expression slowly changed as he opened one page after another. Every letter had been carefully fabricated. Every claim had been invented. Every accusation had been written long before Claire had even entered the palace. His heartbeat grew heavier with every line he read. The palace suddenly felt far too quiet. Adrian immediately ordered Lucas Mercer to investigate every document connected to the former advisor. By sunset, the truth stood plainly before them. A small circle of ambitious nobles had feared the influence a true mate bond might have over the future of the kingdom. They believed Claire's kindness would soften Adrian's leadership and weaken their political control. Unable to challenge destiny itself, they had chosen deception instead. They never expected the king to accept their lies so quickly. Lucas placed the final report upon the royal desk before quietly stepping back. Adrian stared at the pages without moving. The silence between them became almost unbearable. Finally, Adrian spoke, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. "She told me nothing because she trusted me to see the truth myself." Lucas lowered his eyes. "Yes, Your Majesty." Adrian closed the report and walked toward the balcony overlooking the palace gardens where autumn leaves drifted across empty pathways. For the first time in his life, the weight pressing against his chest did not feel like the responsibility of wearing a crown. It felt like regret. Real, undeniable regret. Memories returned one after another. Claire smiling nervously before entering the ceremony. Claire waiting patiently while accusations filled the hall. Claire bowing respectfully even after her heart had been broken. She had never defended herself because she believed the man destined for her would recognize who she truly was. Instead, he had chosen suspicion over trust. Hundreds of miles away, Claire's life continued changing in ways she never expected. The flower shop had become more than temporary shelter. It had become home. Margaret often called her family instead of guest, and neighbors began leaving handwritten notes thanking Claire for the comfort her flowers brought during weddings, birthdays, and quiet moments of remembrance. The sadness inside her heart had not disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled every morning she awakened. She had discovered that peace could grow slowly, one ordinary day at a time. That evening, Adrian entered the palace chapel alone. He stood before the tall stained glass windows as fading sunlight painted the stone floor with gentle colors. He had come seeking forgiveness, but every prayer stopped before reaching his lips because he already knew the person who deserved to hear those words was no longer there. He finally looked toward Lucas, who had waited quietly near the entrance. "Prepare my horse," Adrian said with calm certainty. Lucas studied him carefully. "Where are you going, Your Majesty?" Adrian did not hesitate. "I spent weeks hoping time would silence my mistake." He picked up his traveling cloak instead of his royal robe. "Now I am going to find the woman I should have believed from the very beginning, even if every road reminds me that I may already be too late." The palace gates disappeared behind Adrian before sunrise, leaving only the sound of steady hoofbeats echoing across quiet country roads. For the first time since becoming king, he traveled without a royal escort, without ceremonial banners, and without the comfort of unquestioned authority. Lucas insisted on following from a respectful distance, knowing his duty was no longer simply protecting the throne, but protecting the man carrying its burden. Adrian believed finding Claire would be as simple as following the roads leading away from the capital. Instead, every village offered only another reminder of how completely she had vanished. In the first town, an elderly innkeeper remembered a polite young woman who had stayed only one night before leaving at dawn. In the second village, a merchant recalled selling a modest traveling cloak to someone matching her description nearly 3 weeks earlier. Every conversation ended the same way. She had been there. She had already gone. Each answer arrived just late enough to deepen Adrian's regret. Meanwhile, life in Willow Creek continued with peaceful certainty. Claire had become known throughout the community not as a stranger, but as the gentle young woman whose flower arrangements brightened every celebration and comforted every farewell. She carefully restored neglected gardens, helped neighbors without expecting anything in return, and smiled more often than she had believed possible only a month before. The ache inside her heart still surfaced during quiet evenings, but it no longer defined the person she was becoming. Margaret often watched Claire from the doorway of the flower shop with quiet admiration. One afternoon she said softly, "Some people spend their lives searching for a place where they belong. Somehow, you have helped this town feel more like home simply by being here." Claire smiled, though a trace of sadness remained behind her eyes. "Perhaps I needed a home as much as this place needed flowers." Far beyond Willow Creek, Adrian stopped beside a narrow river where wildflowers lined the banks exactly as Claire had once described during an early conversation they had shared in the palace gardens. He suddenly realized how many small details about her he had ignored while listening to louder voices around him. She had spoken about simple dreams, ordinary places, and helping people who would never know her name. None of those memories had seemed important then. Now they were the only clues guiding him forward. That evening, Adrian and Lucas reached another quiet farming village. Children laughed outside a small bakery while families gathered beneath warm lantern light. Adrian watched them silently, imagining the life Claire might have built if someone had believed her from the beginning. Lucas finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty, every road teaches the same lesson." Adrian looked toward the fading sunset. "Which lesson is that?" Lucas answered carefully. "Trust lost through fear cannot be restored by arriving quickly. It can only be restored by arriving honestly." Adrian nodded without speaking. He understood that every mile ahead would demand more than an apology. Somewhere beyond the next hills, Claire was no longer waiting for the king who had doubted her. She was becoming someone stronger, someone whose happiness no longer depended upon a palace or a crown. As night settled across the countryside, Adrian tightened his traveling cloak and continued forward beneath a sky filled with quiet stars, knowing that the greatest distance separating them was no longer measured in miles, but in the trust he had once failed to protect. Weeks slowly passed as winter approached the kingdom, and every mile Adrian traveled demanded another sacrifice. Royal messages found him on dusty roads instead of inside palace chambers. The council requested his immediate return to settle disputes between noble families, approve trade agreements, and attend ceremonies that only a king could lead. Adrian read each letter carefully before folding it away unanswered. For the first time since wearing the crown, he chose a single promise over the comfort of authority. Back in Silver Moon Palace, concern quietly grew among the royal council. Some nobles questioned whether the king had abandoned his responsibilities. Others argued that a ruler searching endlessly for one woman placed emotion above the stability of the kingdom. Meetings that once ended with confident agreement now dissolved into whispered disagreements. Advisors who had praised Adrian's caution only weeks before began doubting his judgment. Lucas noticed the change each time another messenger arrived carrying increasingly urgent requests. One evening, they stopped at a small roadside and surrounded by snow-covered pine trees. As horses rested in the stable, Lucas carefully placed another sealed letter before Adrian. The council says they cannot delay the winter assembly any longer. Adrian stared into the fireplace without reaching for the message. Do they mention Claire? Lucas quietly shook his head. No, Your Majesty. Adrian finally looked up with calm determination. Then the kingdom can wait one more day. Across the countryside, Claire had no idea how deeply the palace had begun changing. Her mornings remained wonderfully ordinary. She arranged flowers before sunrise, helped Margaret welcome customers throughout the day, and often visited elderly neighbors who could no longer tend their own gardens. Willow Creek had become more than a refuge. It had become a place where people valued kindness above titles. No one bowed when Claire entered a room. No one judged her through rumors. They simply appreciated the gentle woman who always remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet moments when someone needed encouragement the most. One crisp afternoon, Margaret invited Claire to help decorate the town square for the winter festival. Children laughed while hanging handmade lanterns from tree branches, families baked pies together, and musicians rehearsed cheerful melodies beneath fresh, evergreen garlands. Watching the simple celebration unfold, Claire realized something surprising. She no longer measured her happiness by memories of the palace. She had built a new life with her own hands, one honest day after another. Yet beneath that peaceful confidence, the mate bond still whispered quietly. Occasionally, she would pause while arranging flowers, overcome by an unexpected wave of loneliness that did not entirely belong to her. She gently pressed a hand against her heart before returning to work, choosing not to wonder where Adrian might be or why the feeling continued growing stronger. Hundreds of miles away, Adrian stood upon a snowy hillside overlooking another small village. An elderly shepherd pointed toward a distant valley after hearing Claire's description. A young woman with kind blue eyes stayed there for a while, he recalled. She spent her mornings helping anyone who needed an extra pair of hands. She left behind smiles wherever she went. Adrian lowered his eyes with quiet regret. Every person he met remembered Claire for her generosity instead of the accusations that had once surrounded her. The farther he traveled, the more clearly he understood the measure of the woman he had failed to trust. As evening settled over the snow-covered road, Adrian tightened his traveling cloak against the cold wind and continued forward, while somewhere beyond the next mountain range, Claire laughed gently with children decorating lanterns beneath a sky filled with the first stars of winter. Completely unaware that the king who had once broken her heart was slowly surrendering everything he had once believed mattered in order to earn the chance to face her again. Winter settled gently across Willow Creek, covering rooftops with fresh snow and turning every garden into a quiet painting of white and silver. Claire Bennett had become part of the town in ways she never expected. Every morning, she opened Margaret's flower shop before sunrise, arranging evergreen branches, winter berries, and delicate white blossoms that brighten homes during the cold season. The The people no longer called her the young traveler. They simply called her Claire, and hearing her name spoken with kindness instead of suspicion slowly healed the wounds she had carried from the palace. One crisp afternoon, the town square filled with cheerful voices as families prepared for the winter festival. Children gathered around a large evergreen tree, carefully hanging handmade ornaments while musicians rehearsed gentle melodies nearby. Claire knelt beside a little girl struggling to tie a silver ribbon onto one of the lower branches. With patient hands and a warm smile, she helped finish the bough before stepping back to admire the simple decoration. The little girl's grateful laughter echoed through the square, and for a brief moment Claire realized she had smiled without forcing herself to. At almost the same hour, Adrian and Lucas entered Willow Creek from the northern road after weeks of searching. Snow rested upon their cloaks, and the long journey had softened every trace of royal pride once visible in the king's posture. Adrian quietly asked a local merchant whether a young woman with blue eyes and remarkable kindness lived nearby. The merchant smiled immediately. "You must mean Claire from the flower shop," he replied. "She has helped nearly everyone in this town." Adrian's heart skipped. After countless villages and endless unanswered roads, he had finally reached the place where her story continued. Yet instead of rushing forward, he remained standing in silence. He suddenly realized that finding Claire was the easy part. Earning the right to speak with her would be far more difficult. From across the snow-covered square, Adrian finally saw her. Claire stood beneath the decorated evergreen tree, wearing a simple cream-colored winter coat and knitted scarf, laughing softly as children proudly showed her their handmade ornaments. She looked peaceful in a way he had never seen inside the palace. There was no fear in her eyes, no uncertainty in her smile. Only quiet contentment built through ordinary days surrounded by people who had trusted her from the very beginning. Adrian felt both overwhelming relief and quiet sorrow. The woman before him was no longer waiting for someone to rescue her broken heart. She had already begun rebuilding it herself. Claire sensed something familiar before she saw him. The invisible mate bond stirred gently inside her chest, carrying an emotion she had tried to forget. She slowly turned toward the far side of the square. Their eyes met across the falling snow. Time seemed to pause as every sound faded into the quiet winter air. Neither of them moved. Adrian did not call her name. Claire did not walk away. They simply stood facing one another, separated by only a few yards yet divided by months of regret, silence, and painful memories. After several long moments, Claire offered a small, polite smile, the same courteous expression she gave every stranger in town. Then she turned back toward the children waiting beside the evergreen tree. Adrian watched without resentment because he understood exactly what that smile meant. She no longer hated him, but the place in her heart that once belonged to him was no longer waiting to be reclaimed. It would have to be earned, one honest step at a time. The morning after their silent reunion, Willow Creek awakened beneath a blanket of fresh snow sparkling beneath pale winter sunlight. Claire opened the flower shop as she always did, arranging white lilies, evergreen branches, and crimson berries into simple bouquets that filled the small room with warmth against the cold outside. She expected life to continue exactly as it had the day before. What she did not expect was to see Adrian quietly sweeping snow away from the front walkway before customers began arriving. He wore no royal cloak, no silver crown, and no symbol announcing that he ruled an entire kingdom. To everyone passing along the street, he looked like an ordinary traveler, helping an elderly shopkeeper prepare for another busy morning. Margaret stepped outside carrying a basket of flower pots and looked at Adrian with quiet curiosity. He accepted the heavy basket without hesitation and carefully placed each pot beside the entrance exactly where she requested. He never mentioned who he was. He never explained why he had come. He simply asked if there was anything else that needed to be done. Throughout the following days, Adrian remained in Willow Creek without asking Claire for forgiveness or demanding a private conversation. Instead, he repaired broken fences after heavy snowfall, carried firewood to elderly neighbors, shoveled paths leading to the schoolhouse, and helped children build wooden benches for the town square before the spring thaw arrived. Whenever someone thanked him, he smiled politely and returned to work. Claire noticed everything, even though Adrian never looked toward her expecting recognition. She watched from the flower shop window as he quietly repaired the greenhouse roof damaged during a recent storm. She saw him helping the baker unload flour before sunrise and carrying supplies for families whose wagons had become trapped in deep snow. Every kind gesture reminded her of the man she had once believed Adrian could become. Yet remembering also meant remembering the day he had doubted her when she needed him most. One peaceful afternoon, Claire carried fresh flowers to the small community chapel overlooking the frozen river. As she arranged white roses beneath the stained glass windows, she heard slow footsteps behind her. Adrian stopped several feet away, careful not to invade the quiet space she had chosen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "I came here to apologize." Claire gently adjusted another flower before answering. "You already traveled a long way." Adrian lowered his eyes. "Distance is not an apology." His voice remained calm, free of excuses. "I believe people who had never earned my trust instead of the woman who had." Claire looked toward him for the first time since he entered the chapel. There was no pride left in his expression, only honesty. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked softly. Adrian slowly shook his head. "You never asked me if the accusations were true." The words settled between them with painful simplicity. Adrian closed his eyes briefly before answering. "I know." He did not defend himself. He did not explain the pressure of the council or the burden of the crown. He accepted the silence because he understood that no explanation could erase what had happened. Claire picked up the basket of flowers and quietly walked toward the chapel door. As she passed Adrian, she paused for only a moment. "Thank you for helping this town," she said gently. "They deserve kindness." Then she stepped into the winter sunlight and continued home. Adrian remained inside the quiet chapel, realizing that although Claire had acknowledged his presence, she still spoke to him with the same respectful distance she offered any stranger. For the first time in his life, he understood that forgiveness could never be requested. It could only be patiently earned, one honest choice at a time. Several days after their quiet conversation inside the chapel, Willow Creek gathered in the town square for its annual winter festival. Snow rested gently upon rooftops, strings of warm lanterns stretched between wooden buildings, and families filled the streets with cheerful conversations that carried through the crisp afternoon air. Claire spent the morning decorating the community stage with evergreen garlands and white flowers, while Margaret greeted neighbors with homemade pastries. Life felt peaceful, steady, and beautifully ordinary. Adrian remained in the background, helping wherever an extra pair of hands was needed without drawing attention to himself. He repaired a loose wooden railing near the skating pond, carried supplies for elderly shopkeepers, and quietly stepped aside whenever someone thanked him. Very few people in Willow Creek knew he was their king. To everyone else, he was simply a respectful traveler who worked harder than he spoke. That afternoon, a royal messenger rode into town carrying the silver crest of the palace. Snow scattered beneath the horse as curious townspeople gathered to watch. The messenger immediately found Adrian and bowed deeply before presenting a sealed letter. Lucas recognized the royal seal before Adrian even opened it. Inside was an official decree from the council demanding the king's immediate return. It warned that continued absence would allow the council to appoint a temporary regent until Adrian resumed his duties. Lucas looked at him with quiet concern. "Your Majesty, this decision cannot be delayed forever." Adrian folded the letter carefully before slipping it into his coat. His expression remained calm. "Neither could the decision I delayed months ago." Without another word, he walked toward the center of the festival where townspeople had begun gathering for the evening celebration. Claire noticed him approaching but continued arranging candles around the stage, believing he had simply come to help again. Instead, Adrian slowly stepped onto the small wooden platform where community announcements were usually made. The cheerful conversations gradually faded as everyone turned toward the unfamiliar traveler. Lucas quietly moved to one side, while the royal messenger remained frozen in surprise. Adrian looked across the crowd before his eyes finally settled on Claire. His voice carried clearly through the peaceful square. "There was a day when I allowed fear to speak louder than trust. A woman who deserved my faith received only my doubt." Murmurs spread through the audience as several villagers exchanged confused glances. Adrian continued without hesitation. "The fault was mine alone. No title, no responsibility, and no crown excuses that failure. Claire stood perfectly still, unable to look away. Adrian reached into his coat and slowly removed the royal signet that identified him as king. Holding it in both hands, he placed it upon the wooden platform before everyone watching. If returning to the palace means pretending my greatest mistake no longer matters, then I cannot return. Even the falling snow seemed to pause. If the woman I failed chooses a life that no longer includes me, I will respect that choice. But I will never again place a throne above what is right. Silence filled the square until every person present understood they were witnessing something far greater than a public apology. They were watching a king willingly place his authority beneath his conscience. Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes, not because Adrian had asked for another chance, but because he had not asked at all. He had accepted responsibility without expecting forgiveness in return. For the first time since leaving the palace, she saw not the ruler who had broken her heart, but the man who had finally learned what true strength required. Snow continued falling softly over Willow Creek long after the winter festival ended, leaving the town wrapped in peaceful silence. Adrian remained exactly where he had stood after placing his royal signet upon the wooden platform. No one spoke for several long moments. The villagers had expected a king to defend his pride or protect his title. Instead, they had watched a man accept full responsibility for the deepest mistake of his life without asking for sympathy in return. Claire quietly stepped away from the gathering and walked toward the small bridge crossing the frozen stream at the edge of town. She needed time more than answers. The evening sky reflected shades of blue and silver across the snow as she rested both hands upon the wooden railing. Every memory returned with remarkable clarity. She remembered the hope she had carried into the palace, the silence that had followed Adrian's decision, the lonely road leading away from everything she believed her future would become, and the ordinary kindness that had slowly helped her rebuild a life she never expected to love. A few moments later, she heard familiar footsteps approach before stopping several feet behind her. Adrian did not move any closer. He had finally learned that respect sometimes meant allowing another person all the space they needed. The quiet between them felt different now. It no longer carried anger. It carried honesty. Claire turned to face him with calm eyes. "When I left the palace, I thought I had lost everything," she said softly. "But I discovered who I could become without fear." Adrian listened without interrupting. "And I discovered who I had become because of fear," he answered. "That is someone I never wish to be again." Claire studied his face carefully. The confidence that once came from unquestioned authority had been replaced by humility earned through difficult choices. He no longer looked like a man trying to win back what he had lost. He looked like someone willing to live with the consequences of his actions if that was what justice required. She smiled gently. "You spent months trying to find me." Adrian nodded once. "Not to ask you to return." His voice remained steady. "Only to tell you that you deserve the truth, my trust, and my apology from the very beginning." Claire slowly closed the distance between them until they stood only a single step apart. She reached into her coat pocket and carefully placed the royal signet back into Adrian's hands. "A kingdom still needs its king," she whispered. Adrian looked at the signet but did not immediately close his fingers around it. Only if the king remembers that every crown is lighter than another person's heart. Claire smiled through quiet tears before gently taking his hand. This time there was no ceremony, no audience demanding a perfect ending, and no invisible expectation placed upon destiny. There was only a woman choosing freely and a man grateful enough to accept that choice with humility. Months later, Silver Moon Palace welcomed its king home, but those who knew him best noticed something had changed forever. Adrian listened more carefully than he spoke. Every voice, no matter how small, received the same respect he once failed to give Claire. Beside him stood the Omega who had never returned because of a title, a crown, or an ancient bond. She returned because she recognized the man standing beside her had become worthy of the trust he once broke. Together they transformed the kingdom into a place where compassion carried greater authority than pride, and where truth was never sacrificed for convenience again. Long after their story became part of the kingdom's history, people remembered one lesson above every other. A broken heart cannot be healed by power, promises, or destiny alone. It can only be healed when someone has the courage to change, the patience to earn forgiveness, and the wisdom to understand that genuine love is always a choice freely given.